Hello and welcome. My name is Diana Havens and I will be your TLC host for this session, Global Climate Change and National Security Research Results and Challenges, brought to us by Dr. John Ackerman and Gabe Jolivet. We are excited that you've joined us today to hear this presentation. The chat window will be open, so please feel free to participate and ask questions. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Ackerman.
Hello everyone, my name is Gabe Jolivet. I'm the Chair of Political Science and Military Studies here at Ashford University. And on the line with his Ashford logoed t-shirt is my wonderful co-faculty. His name is John Ackerman. Hi, John.
Hey, Gabe. Hi, everybody.
We are very excited to be here today for the next about 30 minutes or so. We're going to talk about climate change and national security, which is obviously at the center of many news stories if you follow the news. First, I want to mention that this project was made possible through the UFP. The UFP, it's the University Fellowship Program grant. The UFP was generous enough to allow us to go to Washington, D.C. for 1 week, and we could not have made that possible without the support of the institution. Let's look a little bit about what we're going to look at today. In a few seconds, I'm going to discuss the purpose excuse me, of this presentation. We will give you some background information. We're going to discuss the methods behind the research. We're going to obviously, hopefully discuss the results. We will have also a strong discussion about the limitations associated with this research. And then hopefully we will have time for 1 or 2 questions. Times, of course, is of the essence. So hopefully you have heard about climate change, right? Climate change is an environmental reality, despite what some may think. And really, climate change is impacting us here in the United States and obviously abroad. And so John and I were very interested in trying to understand and to look at the extent the federal government was actually getting ready to address the challenges on the national security level because of global climate change. So what we did is we look at 3 different agencies. We look at the DoD, which is the Defense Department. We look at the DOS, which is the State Department. And we look at DHS, which is Homeland Security. And really what we try to do is really to look to which extent are they ready to address the challenges of climate change on national security. And so John is going to talk quickly about 3 different research questions we looked at.
The starting point for us was a executive order from President Obama that directed all U.S. federal government agencies to begin adaptation efforts towards climate change. And so we wanted to link our research to the agencies that were most tied to providing national security. So that's why we selected the Department of Defense, Department of State, Homeland Security. And then we looked at how exactly are they using processes, systems, policies to adapt to climate change. And in addition, for us to better understand what they were doing, we decided to use 2 theoretical frameworks, one based on organizational culture and the other on bureaucratic leadership, in order to better understand what was happening within these agencies. And then we decided that, well, in order to really get a better understanding, we needed to talk to the people who were responsible for implementing that adaptation policies, plans, and procedures. So we decided we had to go to Washington, D.C. and talk to those who were accountable for what was going on and investigate more what kind of culture that they were dealing with and what kind of leadership challenges they were facing. And when we began our research, we found that there wasn't a lot of information out there on what the agencies were doing, but there was a lot of research on climate change and national security implications. And we found that many organizations were researching this, the Department of Defense and being one of the major ones. And they determined that this is one of the most serious threats to U.S. national security. And because it's a serious threat, the only entity that can respond effectively to that is a government entity. And again, the leadership qualities, the culture, and the resources that a government can provide are extremely important if we're going to adapt to climate change. And when we did our research, we found that there were primarily not much out there. And the two major reports that we found were one by the U.S. Corps of Engineers and another one by the Congressional Research Service. And each of these looked at the adaptation plans that were mandated by the executive order from President Obama and how these different agencies within the US government were responding to that executive order and how well they were doing. And since there wasn't a whole lot of research out there, obviously that presented an opportunity for us to build on what these two reports had found and also to expand that into other areas to include culture and leadership.
So now that we gave you kind of the background information and what we're going to look at, let's look at the framework and especially the theories, because we always need to ground our research in theories. So I'm going to cover the culture, and John is going to discuss the leadership aspect. So as you may know, there's no universal definition of what culture is, right? And so we decided to go with Morgan's back in 1997, which is a very ethnocentric approach of culture, which is really about those shared beliefs, those shared values, something that people share in common, so that is going to be kind of their driving force. So it's again, a very interesting approach of culture, which is going to be those sense of belonging to a specific group because you share something in common. And based on that, we have noticed that there's mostly 4 different approaches of organizational culture. There's the clan, there's the adhocracy, there's the market, and there's the famous hierarchy one. So what does it mean in plain English, even with my sexy French accent? The clan one, which is all about collaboration, right? When you share something in common, you can team build, right? You can have a group of people coming together and working together in order to achieve something. But it's really about collaboration. The adhocracy, it's all about creation, the creative aspect, right? It's about innovation, about entrepreneurship, it's about vision, setting a vision for the group. Usually in the United States, we're more familiar with number 3 and number 4. Number 3, it's about market. We can call it competition or competing. Is you have different ideas, different groups, and they're competing with each other. And ultimately, the goal is obviously to drive the results towards production and beyond. And the last one, which is sadly very used in the United States and in Western culture, it's about hierarchy, otherwise known as control. And so in this case, it's all about being consistent, being about uniform, the idea of efficiency, all with a very a preset idea of how things work together. So those are going to be the 4 models we're going to look at, and how do people within each of those agencies work together in order to achieve something. And John is going to look at the leadership now.
When we were doing our research, we wanted to find also a good definition of leadership, and we came across one by Van Wert, which nicely incorporated many of the concepts of organizational culture, and the idea that the leader is responsible for giving everyone a sense of cohesiveness, a shared sense of mission, shared sense of values, and things like that. And so this set us up well for our investigation into different archetypes of leadership. And what we found were 4 very commonly used archetypes. A charismatic leadership. Many people have seen those before. A person who's very persuasive, very charming, great talker, and they get people focused on where the organization wants to go. Now, servant leadership is more trying to get people to have a shared sense of empathy or a shared sense of mission, and getting those people to feel as though they're providing goods and services that are so important for the organization. Transactional, a little bit different. They're more structured and directed. They know that the people within the organization are usually mostly self-directed. They can do the job without much guidance, and all this transactional leader has to do is point them in the right direction. Transformational is very similar to the charismatic, the inspirational person, and this transformational leader actually tries to change the organizational somewhat in order to accomplish the goals and the mission. So this difference between the charismatic and the transformational is important to acknowledge.
So now let's look at the methods, right? We set up, our research question, we set up our framework. So now the question is, how did we do it, right? So we divided the research in 3 different steps. Phase number 1, which is, well, what is out there, right? What do we know about actually the federal government, and to which extent is it ready to address climate change or national security? So it was really about a content analysis, and especially through the DoD, DOS, and DHS. The second phase is, well, it's nice to know what's out there, but let's go talk to people which are actually doing stuff, right? So phase number 1 is about the theories, and step number 2 is about the practices. So John and I went to Washington, DC, and we met with upper leadership in those 3 departments to really know how they do it at the organizational level. And then when we came back from Washington, DC after a week, we say, well, this is what the literature tells us. This is the practice. How do they match, right? And so we really use the comparative analysis is to which extent they fit and to which extent are they different. Does it make sense? So that was the idea, is really to know what's out there. Let's look at how they do it, and then just let's compare and contrast. And let's see if we can learn anything about it. And John is going to obviously discuss the results.
When we looked at the Department of Defense, of course, it's a classic hierarchical type of organization, and also sometimes it's been accused of being very stovepiped. But we found when we did our investigation of climate change, the leadership had embraced this. They were taking on this challenge, and they were what was described as mainstreaming it. They were taking climate adaptation policies, programs, and procedures and placing them throughout how the organization operated from top to bottom. And a lot of this was due to some very powerful leadership. Secretary Hagel, very inspiring with his guidance, and very transformational, and perhaps even could be called charismatic. And he was followed by Secretary Carter, who was more of a transactional type of leader who kept the process going and kept the ball rolling. And the Department of Defense was making and continues to make good progress toward adapting to climate change. In the Department of State, we found the mainstreaming was also occurring, but in a little bit different way. The Department of State could probably be called more of an adhocracy type of structure, organizational structure. And the leadership was coming from top, and also there was a lot of emphasis and changes coming from the bottom. And part of this was the people out in the field, out at the different embassies, were designing what were called integrated country strategies. And within that process, they were looking how to green their efforts, how to bring solar panels and other climate change adaptations into various countries to help them adapt to climate change. And this was also occurring within the Department of State itself. And so this whole process was led by Secretary Kerry, who, in his words, climate change is a preeminent threat to national security. So for him, it was very serious. And so he brought a lot of leadership, but it was also a lot of change and creativity was coming from the bottom too. In contrast, the Department of Homeland Security does not have that type of leadership. It does not have that type of structure. And what we saw there was clans. 22 different clans, 22 different agencies working sometimes against each other in order to accomplish a variety of different missions that are loosely grouped toward providing homeland security. And this was difficult for them because some of the organizations did not see any relevance to climate change. Other organizations only saw it as something that they had to react to, particularly FEMA reacting to national natural disasters or to events that were driven by climate change, and also the Coast Guard also reacting to changes in the climate. So these organizations were working hard to do their job, but again, the clan structure impeded quite a bit.
And if I may follow up, John, I think John made a great point about it was very apparent when we were in Washington, D.C., but two clans. There was on one hand the DHS, Homeland Security, which was very reactive. They did not really care about actually the causes of climate change. They did not really care about climate change itself. It was really about to which extent are we ready to deal with the aftermath of climate change. And for instance, you can think about what happened in Puerto Rico, in Texas, or in Florida, just to give you an idea. So it was very reactive, and ultimately for the DHS, climate change is still kind of a dirty word, kind of taboo. If we don't talk about it, it's not there. We just want to make sure that our 22 different agencies with 22 different missions can handle the aftermath. On the other hand, the DOS, not very surprisingly, but maybe more surprisingly from the DOD, they understand that actually climate change does impact the way people act. So when you look at, obviously, lack of access to water, lack of access to food, when you look at rising temperature and wave of migrations, the DOS, State Department, and the DOD, the Defense Department, understand that that is going to impact the national security of the United States, not only here in the lower 48, but also abroad. So they do understand that you have to be much more proactive, because once it's happening, it's too late. So you really had two different approaches, from one hand, the DHS, which is about law enforcement, and the DOD, which was much more proactive, thinking about what obviously is next. So obviously this week, a year ago, something happened, which is a new administration, right? We had a new President of the United States since obviously January. And so this research was conducted under the Obama administration, the last few months of the Obama administration. Obviously, it's going to be very interesting for us and for you to follow the changes that are going to either have happened or are happening or will happen tomorrow, because the current administration has a very different appreciation and vision about the effect or the existence itself of climate change. So I will obviously, encourage you to follow the news, because the ability of those organizations to react to climate change is also a consequence of political will. And so what John did is, I think, John, you did contact those three agencies since the new administration. And what did you find out?
Well, the DOD continues to view climate change as what they call a threat multiplier, which is, as Gabe related to, the ability of these different types of changes in climate to cause instability, especially in some of the poorer, less developed areas of the world. Department of State has ran away from the topic. It's seldom discussed. Many of the people who are working on this are now assigned to other tasks. And Homeland Security continues to run along worrying about threats to the different agencies. Their mission is law enforcement, and their only kind of close reaction to climate change is through resiliency, through FEMA and some other organizations. So it's definitely changed quite a bit. But one of the problems that we found within our survey, within our research, as most researchers find, is that we had a fairly small sample size. We tried to contact as many people as we could, and it kept getting narrowed down and narrowed down. And we found 2 people at Homeland Security, one at Department of Defense and one at departments of state. We sent them initial surveys to kind of narrow down what we would talk about, and only got one response, and that kind of threw us off a little bit. And also, as we got closer and closer to the time for our interviews, they had less and less time for us because things were getting pretty busy as the impending election was coming about. And also, they were very, very concerned about the election and the confidentiality and attribution problems that it could cause. And so they were not willing to put their names into our report, but they were willing to talk openly about their concerns, but again, without attribution.
And if I may follow up about the sample size, we do have obviously a small sample size, 2 DHS, 1 DOD, and 1 DOS. One thing, however, I want to mention is we went directly to the people in charge of actually climate change within each of those organizations. And yes, when you think about the DOD, right, the Department of Defense, which is a mammoth, right? I just talked about the elephant in the room, but the DOD is a mammoth of the federal government. There's only one person in charge of climate change within the entire DOD, if you can believe that, right? Same stuff with the DOS, the Department of State. It was one person for the entire department, right? Which has more than 185 representations abroad, one person in Washington, DC, in Foggy Bottom, the headquarters, dealing with climate change. What they have, though, is that they are included in the processes, actually, of those organizations. So when you look at the DOD, she was by herself in a very nice corner office, but she was part of a bigger discussion, and all the other departments were actually included in the processes. That's why maybe there's hope with the current administration, because actually the DOD, especially the DOD, had a lot of mechanism and processes already in place that may be much harder actually to change because it's already there. And unlike the DHS, where there's really no processes, clear processes. So we do acknowledge the limitation about the sample size. However, we went really to the person in charge so that we had a very good understanding of what each of those agencies is doing and not doing. So because time is running out, John, do you want to discuss the conclusions?
You bet. We found organizational culture matters, and we found that how these agencies viewed themselves and how they were structured made a difference on their ability to adapt to climate change, and also leadership hugely impacted whether or not they took climate change seriously. And what it really boiled down to, you had to have some charismatic transformational style leadership in order for changes to occur, like the DOD did. And also Secretary Kerry at the Department of State was extremely charismatic and a driving force for the changes that were happening within the State Department. But Secretary Johnson at the Department of Homeland Security seldom talked about climate change, seldom gave it much thought because he was too busy trying to keep those 22 organizations on the same page as much as he could. And those clans were constantly fighting with each other. And so climate change was never a major topic for them. And again, charismatic leadership makes a difference and probably could really help the Department of Homeland Security focus on this new threat.
That's great. So because we rushed today, do we have any questions? I cannot see the chat right now. So we wanted to go a little bit faster so that we will be open to anything you may have. So Diana, do we have any questions?
You do not have any questions.
Okay.
You still have about 7 minutes, so you have
I know.
questions. You went really fast. Good job.
I know. We are, we are pretty impressed. So, I know. So if you have any questions, you're not sure or you're afraid of asking, you can always ask my wonderful core faculty. His name is John Ackerman, and it's john.ackerman@ashford.edu. If you have nothing better to do, you can always email me. I welcome your emails. My email is gabe.jolivet@ashford.edu. So any questions?
I would highly encourage everybody to, if you get a chance, to look at the new U.S. Global Change Research Program Climate Science report that just came out. It is a comprehensive view of climate science by the 13 different agencies that have something to do with it, to include Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency, the NOAA, and NASA. And their conclusions are based on thousands of different reports and papers, and how the new administration deals with this will be fascinating to follow. And what's going on with the US EPA stance on climate change? Well, they've eliminated much of the climate information from their website.
Yeah.
Current Secretary, Mr. Pruitt, does not agree that climate change is primarily driven by humans, which was the conclusion of the new science report. And he is very skeptical about the status of the science. And so he is implementing steps to reduce the EPA's influence on greenhouse gases, both mitigation and adaptation efforts. So I don't know how far he'll go or how far his efforts will reach. But we also just learned today that the government of Syria is signing on to the Paris Agreement on climate change, making the US the only nation on the planet that is not a member of the Paris Agreement, unfortunately.
If I may follow up, you may wonder, what, obviously, and John mentioned it, and we have access to it. So if you want a copy of it, just shoot us an email and we will send it to you. But you may wonder, why did we not extend, right, our reach to the DOE, which is the Energy Department, or the EPA, obviously? We really try to focus our energy and resources on the three agencies that mostly deal with national security, right? EPA, the nature of the EPA is not about national security. The mission of the Department of Energy is not about national security. They are part of it, don't get me wrong, but their mission is not. So we really try to focus on three agencies that their mission is to protect the interest of the United States, here in the United States, of the lower 48 and abroad, if it makes sense.
There was a question about what was the name of the article. Actually, it's a new science report. I think that's what you're asking about. It's by the U.S. Global Change Research Group, and it's called the Climate Science Special Report. There were several articles about it in most of the major news organizations, and many of them have links directly to it. If you need that link to it, just send me an email. I've got the PDF downloaded. It's about 477 pages, and it is the state of the art on what is happening in climate research here in the United States, and also with the contributions by many scientists overseas.
And that's why, actually, if I may follow up, we have heard about climate change, in the news lately. It's because of this report, and because there's no or little doubt that human activity is the main factor for global climate change. And very interestingly, though, is the current administration could have tried to, put a hold on it, but they decided not to put a hold on the report. So it's a very interesting report. I will encourage you to read part of it, at least the executive summary and the conclusion, because it's an eye-opening about what does the science tell us about climate change as well.
I think that the U.S. population has made some dramatic moves toward understanding that climate change is occurring, that it's serious, and that it is something that we should be concerned about. Whether or not we're too late, well, that depends upon, how quickly you think we can address the problem. There's a lot of research out there that says we could rapidly move to a low emission economy within the next 20 years, and with very little impact compared to the costs of maintaining the same economy. And we could do that within 15 years. And they even think that it would be a more productive, even a more effective and efficient economy than the one we currently have. And the reduction in pollution levels by the new renewable technologies and renewable energy sources would be a real boon for many different areas of the world.
And if I may, because it's going to be time, Chris, there's also another issue, which is about the belief, right? The political belief in climate change. Is climate change the political reality or not? And if you listen to NPR, there was a wonderful report last weekend called To the Best of Our Knowledge. And they discuss actually the impact of political organization. And in this case, they look at the Koch brothers and American for Prosperity, and how actually, when they started to actually fund political campaign, the Republican Party changes understanding about climate change. And then in the last Congress, there was only 4 congresspersons of the Republican Party who agreed that climate change was actually man-made. So there's a political aspect to it. And if you have podcast on NPR One, I will encourage you to listen because it was a very interesting report.
And just to follow up a question about the deniers, Merchants of Doubt, excellent report. And that's probably where you may see the most hope, because the people who were responsible for pushing tobacco and that it was harmless and things like that, eventually many of them were taken to court. They were found to have been collaborating and lying, and they were systematically punished for that. And right now there are court cases in New York and I believe California, where they're suing the Exxon and some of the other large fossil fuel industries because they kept climate change science secret, and even from their stockholders. So there's more coming that may be through the court soon. So hopefully that will change things.